All right, today we are taking a look at a slightly modified AP Part 2, representing all the Buffalo Sabres fans out in the universe there. All right, actually I added another question as well to this. So, all right, assume that the country of Eichel is currently in a recession. This is going to be important information, so let's make a note of that. The first thing it asks us to do is to draw a correctly labeled PPF curve for Eichel and they only produce food and clothing. Show a point that could represent the current output combination and label it A. All right, so basically I want to start with the PPF curve, and on one side I'm going to have food, and on the other side I'm going to have clothing. I don't think the question requires it, but I'm going to use a bode from the origin PPF curve just as a reminder. That indicates increasing opportunity costs for both goods. I think you could have drawn a constant cost curve here as well. So far so good, but I do need to show an output combination and label it A. Now I can't put A anywhere I want. I have to put A in a position that would indicate that the country is currently in recession. And if a country is in recession, that means they are producing below their full employment output. And that means that they have to be producing somewhere inside the PPF curve. They are not using all of their resources efficiently because they are in a recession. So that's what that should look like. Now, this was not in the original AP question, but I did want to add this to kind of show that we can represent some of this in more than one way. So if I want to show a recession using an ADAS model for Eichel, well, on this axis is going to be our price level. On this axis is our output, or real GDP. A downward sloping aggregate demand curve, an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, and our current output would be at Y prime, we'll call it. And this is our current price level with this. Now, to show that this is a recession, again, that has to indicate that our output of food and clothing is less than what is feasible given the resources in Eichel. And that means that our long-run aggregate supply curve has to be in this position, that the potential output, Y star, is greater than the actual output, and that this distance here is the recessionary gap that exists as a result of these economic conditions. All right, so now assume that the Central Bank of Eichel pursues an expansionary monetary policy. So that means that they want to increase M1. And there are three tools that they could use to do that. They could either use the discount rate, they could use the reserve requirement, or they could use open market operations. So this question is specifying that it has to be an open market operation. And so we want to remember that open market operations, that means that they can either buy or sell treasury notes to address the monetary policy. So in this case, since we want this to be an expansionary monetary policy, we want to expand the money supply as well. So we had said that if the Fed were to buy bonds, buying bonds would increase the money supply. And if you recall that if the Fed is buying the bond, that means that they are giving money to the bank, all right? So that coming into the bank is going to be the money going into the bank, and then the bank is able to use that money in order to make loans or do whatever, they're going to loan that money out, and loaning money creates new money that's going to further expand the money supply with it. So if the Fed purchases, they're sending money to the bank in exchange for the bond that the Fed is purchasing. And this additional money is going to increase money supply, and that is the textbook definition of an expansionary monetary policy. Incidentally, they could also lower the discount rate, which would lower the interest rate banks pay to the Federal Reserve for loans. That would encourage more loaning. They could also lower the reserve requirement, choose to have banks hold on to less of their deposits. That would also increase monetary policy. But this question did specify that it had to be an open market operation, so either of those other two answers would not be correct. All right, draw a correctly labeled money market graph and show the short-run effect of the expansionary monetary policy on the nominal interest rate. So they kind of gave us all the tools here with this, right? First, they said that the nominal interest rate, they reminded us that that's what we're measuring, and that this is the output, this is the quantity of money. And we just have to remember that the money supply is vertical, and that money demand is downward sloping. An increase in the money supply because of this expansionary monetary policy is going to have the impact of lowering the interest rate. So the second interest rate is at a lower nominal interest rate. While graphically this makes sense, that the increase in money supply is going to result in a lower interest rate. It makes sense as well if we think about the fact that because more money is in the system, money is going to be easier to come by, and therefore the cost of borrowing money is going to be lower. So just a way to kind of jog back and forth between the graph's interpretation and our common sense. All right, now assume that there's no change to the price level. This is a critical assumption here, no change to the price level. What happens to the real interest rate as a result of the expansionary monetary policy? Well, we have to recall the Fisher equation that basically says that the nominal interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus inflation. All right, and if that's the case, we just saw that the nominal interest rate had decreased, and they're saying that there's no change in the price level, so inflation is going to remain the same, and that means that if inflation's staying the same but nominal decreased, the real interest rate would have to decrease as well with this. Given that the real interest rate has decreased, what happens to the real gross domestic product in the short run? Well, basically what this means is that it is now cheaper for firms to borrow money in the loanable funds market, and that's going to increase their borrowing in the loanable funds market, and that is going to have the impact. It's going to allow them to purchase more goods and services, business investment, so that they can buy the factories and machinery to make additional goods, because now it is cheaper to borrow that money. So essentially, if our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right, we kind of started off looking like this. We'll put price level and our GDP down here, and our aggregate demand now is going to shift to the right and increase such that, if it's done perfectly, our aggregate demand is going to increase as a result of increased investment spending, as a result of the lower interest rates, lower real interest. And that's going to move us from the output we were at back to our full employment output. The economy is going to come out of this recessionary gap. Employment is going to increase, and the economy is going to improve as a result. All right, well, I hope that that's been helpful to you. And if you have any other questions, of course, let me know.